The sun was setting over Los Angeles International Airport on June 14, 2019, as Skyfer Flight 717 prepared for takeoff. The Boeing 777 was destined for Sydney, Australia, a journey that would take over 15 hours, a flight both routine and critical. For the crew aboard, it was just another international trip, another night in the sky. But as the engines roared to life and the aircraft began its ascent into the clouds, none could have known that this flight would become infamous, one that would forever be etched in the history of aviation due to the devastating events that would unfold. Captain Jack Suan, a seasoned pilot with nearly 20 years of experience, sat in the cockpit with a feeling of emptiness. The hum of the engines, the sterile calm of the cockpit, these were all familiar, yet something was missing. Over the past several months, Jack had been battling with personal demons. Despite his outward success, inside he was spiraling. The long hours, the time away from home, the lack of meaningful connections, it all weighed heavily on him. He had always been a professional, but recently he felt more and more isolated. He'd begun to question his purpose, his worth, and the emptiness that seemed to fill the space between the moments when he was at the helm of the plane. Jack's personal struggles were compounded by a growing tension in the cockpit. Co-pilot Ryan Matthew, though younger, was a stickler for protocols and discipline. Ryan was a career-driven professional, someone who lived and breathed aviation safety. His obsession with precision and his stringent adherence to rules often put him at odds with Jack, who preferred a more relaxed approach to his work. The two men had clashed before, but on this particular flight, there was a noticeable rift between them. Ryan, whose meticulous nature had earned him the respect of his colleagues, found Jack's easygoing attitude unsettling. He believed that the pilot's approach was reckless, that Jack's personal issues were affecting his performance in ways that couldn't be ignored. But it wasn't just Ryan who was affected by Jack's troubled state of mind. Emily Carter, the flight attendant, had been working with Jack on several flights over the past few months, and the two had formed a bond. Emily was young, bright, and charismatic, with a natural ability to engage people. She found comfort in Jack's experience and often sought his company in the quiet moments between duties. In return, Jack, lonely and disconnected, found solace in their interactions. What began as a harmless friendship soon morphed into something more intimate. The confined space of the cockpit, the long hours, the constant proximity, this was a powder keg, and Emily and Jack were the match. Their relationship, once innocent, quickly crossed professional boundaries. Emily's flirtation with Jack, initially a harmless distraction, grew into something more dangerous. The lines between pilot and passenger, between professional and personal, blurred as the flight progressed. Emily's presence in the cockpit during off-moors was increasingly frequent, and the conversations between her and Jack grew more personal, more intimate. Ryan noticed the shift in behavior almost immediately. His suspicions were aroused. He had seen flirtations in the past, but this felt different, too close, too risky. He had observed how Emily would linger near Jack, how they shared private conversations, how the usual professional distance had dissipated. Ryan's concerns about safety were no longer just about Jack's ability to navigate the aircraft. They extended to the environment within the cockpit itself. It wasn't just the technicalities of flight that were at stake, but the integrity of the crew and the safety of the passengers aboard the aircraft. Ryan knew something had to be done. The standards that had been drilled into him from the beginning of his career dictated that nothing No personal issue, no matter how trivial, should compromise the safety of the flight. And this was a breach, a serious one at that. The relationship between Jack and Emily was not just a breach of professional boundaries, it was a potential safety hazard. What if something went wrong? What if Jack's distraction led to a misjudgment, or worse, a critical error? But Ryan didn't act immediately. He hesitated, unsure of how to confront the situation. This wasn't just about protocol, it was about the camaraderie between the crew. There was a delicate balance between respect for authority and the need to protect passengers, and Ryan found himself caught in the middle. As the hours passed and the flight continued, the tension in the cockpit grew palpable. Jack's demeanor had shifted. His eyes, once sharp and attentive, now looked distant. Emily, too, seemed less focused, her attention divided between Jack and the burgeoning tension in the cabin. Ryan, sensing the growing danger, began to prepare himself for what he knew was inevitable. A confrontation. Something had to give. The flight continued uneventfully in terms of weather and external conditions, but within the cockpit the atmosphere had become anything but routine. What was meant to be a professional environment had morphed into a volatile space where personal dynamics began to overshadow the very purpose of the flight, ensuring the safety of all those aboard. By the time the first leg of the flight came to an end, and Ryan was scheduled to take over for Jack, the damage had been done. The emotional tension in the cockpit had reached a boiling point. Ryan, unable to ignore the violation of safety protocols he had witnessed, made a decision. He would report the incident to the airline. It was the only course of action that would ensure the safety of the passengers, even if it meant facing the wrath of his colleagues, the disruption of the flight, and the potential fallout that would follow. As Skyfer Flight 717 continued its journey across the Pacific, Ryan Matthews sat in the co-pilot's seat, grappling with the tension that had simmered in the cockpit for the past few hours. His mind raced. He had always prided himself on his professional conduct and adherence to the highest standards of aviation safety. But what he had witnessed in the past few hours, the way Jack Suan and Emily Carter had disregarded their responsibilities, had shaken him to the core. The more Ryan thought about it, the more he realized that there was no alternative. What had happened in the cockpit wasn't just an unfortunate lapse in judgment. It was a clear violation of airline policy, of the very codes that governed their profession. Personal relationships between crew members, especially ones of an intimate nature, were strictly forbidden in aviation for a reason. The confined space of the cockpit, the high-stakes environment of flying an international route, the safety of hundreds of passengers, it all demanded absolute professionalism. Anything less was unacceptable, and the consequences of such a breach could be catastrophic. Ryan's mind was made up. As the flight continued and he carried out his duties, he mentally prepared himself for the difficult conversation he would have to have once they landed in Sydney. Reporting the incident wasn't something he took lightly. He had worked closely with Jack for years, and the two had been colleagues, even friends. He understood the pressures Jack was under, the long hours, the stress of the job, the loneliness, but none of that could justify the reckless behavior he had witnessed. Ryan knew that if he didn't report it, he would be complicit in the violation of safety standards, and that could never be allowed.
As the aircraft made its final descent toward Sydney, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. Jack's usual calm demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an air of frustration and exhaustion. Emily, too, seemed distracted, her movements stiff and uneasy. The shift in the cockpit dynamics was undeniable. Ryan, though professional as ever, couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed, not just in the environment of the cockpit, but in the relationships between the crew. This flight, which should have been a seamless operation, had instead become a microcosm of the broader pressures and tensions that had been building for months. The landing was uneventful, but as the plane taxied to its gate, Ryan took a deep breath. He knew what had to be done. As the passengers began to disembark, he quietly made his way to the airline's security office. It was there that he reported what he had observed during the flight, the inappropriate relationship between Jack and Emily, the safety violations that had taken place, and the impact it could have had on the well-being of the passengers. It was a difficult thing to do, and Ryan knew that once he made the report, there would be no turning back. Within hours, the airline's internal investigation was underway. Jack and Emily were immediately removed from duty and placed under suspension pending further inquiry. The fallout was swift and severe. Ryan found himself in the middle of a storm. He was lauded by some for his courage in bringing the issue to light, but others were more critical. Colleagues whispered about his actions, questioning whether he had overstepped his bounds, whether there had been a more diplomatic way to handle the situation. But Ryan remained resolute. He had done what he believed was right, even if it meant facing professional backlash and alienation from his peers. For Jack, the news of the investigation hit like a ton of bricks. When he was called into a meeting with the airline's senior management, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew that what had been happening in the cockpit with Emily had crossed a line, but he had never imagined it would come to this. The intimate moments he had shared with Emily, moments that had provided a fleeting sense of connection and warmth, now seemed like a distant, foolish mistake. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had risked, not just for himself, but for the people who had trusted him to keep them safe. His pride, his need for validation, his growing loneliness, they had all played a part in clouding his judgment. When Jack was officially informed of the investigation's findings, the reality of the situation hit him like a cold slap. The airline had no choice but to suspend both him and Emily. This was not just about a breach of personal conduct, it was about the integrity of the entire flight operation, about the trust that passengers and fellow crew members placed in the airline to uphold the highest standards of safety. There could be no tolerance for such behavior, and Jack's actions had left the airline with no alternative but to act swiftly and decisively. The news spread quickly through the airline's ranks, and soon, it was all over the media. The story of Captain Jack Swan, a seasoned veteran whose career had been cut short by a personal scandal, became a cautionary tale. The headlines were unforgiving, and the public's perception of Jack, once a trusted figure in the aviation world, was forever tarnished. For Emily, the fallout was no less severe. As a young flight attendant, she had hoped to build a career in aviation, to move up in the ranks, perhaps even to become a flight purser or trainer. But with her dismissal from Skyfer, those dreams were shattered. She became the subject of public ridicule, her professional reputation in tatters. The relationship she had shared with Jack, which she had once viewed as a way to escape the monotony of her work, now felt like a betrayal, not just to her employer, but to herself. Emily was left with nothing but the painful realization that she had allowed herself to get caught up in something that, in hindsight, was a serious lapse in judgment. Jack, too, felt the full weight of his actions. In the days following his dismissal, he fell into a deep depression. The loss of his career, the humiliation of being publicly disgraced, it was all too much to bear. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to navigate even the most difficult situations with calm and competence. But now, that confidence had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of shame and regret. His personal struggles had caught up with him, and the consequences were devastating. As the days turned into weeks, Jack's depression deepened. The isolation he had felt before, the loneliness that had once been manageable, now became overwhelming. Without the structure of his career, without the camaraderie of his fellow pilots, Jack found himself adrift in a sea of despair. He reached out to a few old friends, but their calls were perfunctory, their sympathy thin. The support he had once taken for granted was no longer there. He was alone. It was in this dark and isolated state that Jack made the decision that would seal his tragic fate. The weight of his actions, the collapse of his career, and the public shaming became too much to bear. On the morning of July 4, 2019, Captain Jack Swan took his own life. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Fellow pilots, flight attendants, and airline employees were left stunned and heartbroken. For many, Jack had been more than just a colleague, he had been a mentor, a friend, and a trusted leader. His death was a stark reminder of how personal struggles, when left unchecked, could have disastrous consequences. In the weeks following Captain Jack Swan's tragic death, the aviation world found itself in turmoil. News outlets across the globe reported on the shocking scandal that had unfolded on Skyfer Flight 717. What had once been a routine international flight had now become a cautionary tale, dissected from every angle by media outlets, aviation experts, and even the general public. The tragedy was not just about one pilot's personal failings, it was about the failure of an entire system, a profession that placed immense trust in its pilots, and the consequences when that trust is violated. The story of Flight 717, particularly the personal and professional struggles of Jack Swan, Emily Carter, and the actions of co-pilot Ryan Matthew, captured the public's attention for weeks. What had started as a workplace transgression had spiraled into something much larger, a tale of loneliness, isolation, misguided decisions, and their catastrophic aftermath. The case quickly became a flashpoint for broader debates about the pressures placed on aviation professionals, the role of personal relationships in the workplace, and the ethical responsibility of individuals within high-stakes industries. For the airline, the public relations nightmare was just beginning. Skyfer Airlines, once a respected name in the industry, now found itself at the center of a storm. While the airline had acted swiftly and decisively in suspending Jack and Emily, the damage had already been done. The public's perception of the airline was irreparably altered. Families who had flown on Skyfer flights now questioned whether the airline had put their safety at risk by employing a crew member who had compromised professional boundaries. Passengers, many of whom had trusted the airline with their lives, were now left wondering if they had been put in danger without their knowledge. At the heart of the scandal was the question of accountability. Should Skyfer Airlines have done more to prevent the personal relationship between Jack and Emily from developing in the first place? Were there warning signs that had been ignored? Had the airline's leadership been too focused on meeting operational demands, overlooking the mental health and well-being of its crew members? These were questions that, though difficult, demanded answers. Industry experts and commentators were quick to weigh in, with many pointing out that while personal relationships between crew members were not uncommon, the nature of the relationship that had developed between Jack and Emily was beyond the pale. It wasn't just the emotional entanglement, it was the fact that they had let their personal issues invade the cockpit, compromising the professional integrity that the airline and passengers relied upon. There was a near-universal consensus that the actions of Jack and Emily had not just violated company policy but had also endangered the flight, making it a reckless and avoidable disaster waiting to happen. As for Ryan Matthew, his role in the aftermath was just as scrutinized. While many hailed him as a hero for his courage in reporting the violation, others questioned whether he could have done more to intervene before the situation escalated. Should he have confronted Jack and Emily directly about their inappropriate behavior during the flight? Could he have addressed the issue more tactfully before it reached the point of official intervention? Ryan found himself at the center of a moral dilemma. On the one hand, he had done what he believed was the right thing in reporting the violation. On the other hand, he was forced to confront the fact that his decision had contributed to Jack's downfall, and in a very real way, to his death. In interviews with the media, Ryan explained that he had felt a duty to protect the passengers on Flight 717 and the crew from any potential risks. "I've spent my entire career making sure nothing goes wrong, making sure people are safe," Ryan said in one interview. "What I saw wasn't just a personal issue. It was a serious breach of trust, and I had to make sure it was addressed." But while his actions were seen by some as noble, others viewed them as too harsh, even as a betrayal. Ryan became the subject of intense public scrutiny, with some accusing him of being overly rigid and unfeeling, while others applauded him for his commitment to safety and his professionalism. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, Skyfer Airlines took steps to distance itself from the situation. The airline issued a public statement expressing deep regret for the events surrounding Flight 717, acknowledging the pain and tragedy caused by the loss of Captain Jack Swan. It also promised to review its internal policies to ensure that something like this could never happen again. The airline's leadership pledged to implement stronger oversight on crew behavior, improve mental health support for pilots and flight attendants, and ensure that personal relationships between crew members would be monitored more closely. However, despite these assurances, the damage had already been done. The airline's reputation would never fully recover from the scandal, and many passengers, particularly frequent flyers, chose to switch airlines, seeking alternatives they believed were more trustworthy. The trust that had taken years to build was shattered in an instant. While the airline grappled with the fallout, the wider aviation community also began to take a closer look at the underlying issues raised by the tragedy. For years, the aviation industry had been focused primarily on technical safety, on the mechanics of flight, the training of pilots, and the maintenance of aircraft. But this incident illuminated the pressing need for a broader focus on mental health, emotional well-being, and professional ethics in the workplace. In the wake of Flight 717, many industry experts called for a more open dialogue about the mental health challenges faced by pilots and flight attendants, who often worked in isolating, high-pressure environments. For pilots like Jack Swan, who had spent years away from their families and dealt with the emotional toll of the job, the pressures could become overwhelming. Many called for airlines to adopt more proactive mental health policies, to offer support for struggling crew members, and to create a more transparent culture where issues could be addressed before they reached a crisis point. The tragedy also raised important ethical questions about the relationship between personal desires and professional responsibilities. Was it right for Ryan to report the incident, knowing the consequences it would have for Jack's career and personal life? Did the airline overreact by dismissing Jack and Emily so swiftly, or was the severity of their actions deserving of such a response? The incident illuminated the complex ethical landscape that aviation professionals navigate daily, balancing personal relationships and professional responsibilities in a high-stakes environment. Meanwhile, the families of Jack Swan and Emily Carter were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Jack's family, devastated by his death, struggled to comprehend the chain of events that had led to his tragic end. They spoke out publicly about their pain, lamenting the lack of support Jack had received in dealing with his personal struggles. They also expressed sorrow for the pain Jack had caused to the other members of the crew and the passengers on Flight 717. "Jack was a good man," his wife said in a heartfelt interview. "He made a mistake, but he didn't deserve to die." Emily's family, too, was grappling with the fallout. Emily had once been the bright young flight attendant with a promising future in the airline industry. Now, her name was synonymous with scandal and disgrace. The emotional toll on her family was immense, and they too struggled to understand how things had gone so wrong. But they, like Jack's family, recognized that Emily's actions were born out of personal desperation, emotions she had not known how to handle in such a high-pressure environment. The death of Captain Jack Swan and the scandal surrounding Skyfer Flight 717 left a lasting imprint on the aviation community and beyond. As the months passed and the dust settled, the events that had transpired over that fateful flight continued to spark conversations about the deep flaws within the system, the nature of professional responsibility, and the mental health challenges faced by individuals in high-pressure jobs. The tragedy became a lens through which both the aviation industry and society at large began to re-examine the intersections of personal struggle, workplace dynamics, and professional ethics. In the wake of the incident, Skyfer Airlines, though tarnished by the scandal, made sweeping changes aimed at preventing such a tragedy from ever happening again. The airline took steps to overhaul its internal policies, creating more robust systems for monitoring crew behavior and promoting mental health awareness among employees. One of the first significant changes was the implementation of regular, mandatory mental health check-ins for all pilots and crew members. Recognizing that the pressures of the job, long hours, isolation, and the emotional toll of dealing with life-or-death situations daily, could take a significant toll on a person's mental well-being, Skyfer began offering more comprehensive mental health support. Counseling services, stress management programs, and peer support networks were introduced across the airline's workforce. These programs were designed not only to address emotional struggles but also to create a culture of openness where employees could discuss personal challenges without fear of judgment or repercussion. In addition to these internal reforms, the tragedy of Flight 717 served as a wake-up call for the wider aviation industry. Other airlines followed suit, creating similar programs designed to prioritize the mental health of their crew members. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, also issued new guidelines, advocating for increased mental health awareness in flight operations. These changes were a positive step forward, but they were also a reminder of how long the issue of mental health had been ignored in the aviation field. While some lauded these efforts as necessary and long overdue, others argued that the airline industry needed to go further. They pointed out that mental health programs should not just be a reaction to a crisis but a proactive part of training from the very beginning of a pilot's or flight attendant's career. It became clear that the stigma surrounding mental health in aviation had to be broken down, and that crew members needed to be given the tools and support to manage the emotional and psychological challenges of the job. One of the most enduring aspects of the tragedy was the ethical debate surrounding the actions of Captain Jack Swan and Emily Carter. In hindsight, many questioned how the relationship between Jack and Emily had escalated to the point where it violated safety protocols. Was it simply an error in judgment, or was it symptomatic of deeper, systemic problems within the airline industry? How much responsibility did the airline, and even the other crew members, bear for allowing the situation to unfold? The violation of professional boundaries was something that could not be ignored. The cockpit, often described as the most high-stakes work environment, demanded absolute professionalism. There was no room for personal distractions, no matter how understandable the human motivations behind them. While both Jack and Emily had been dealing with personal difficulties, their actions had ultimately jeopardized the safety of the flight and violated the trust placed in them by the airline and the passengers. However, the ethical questions that arose from the situation were complex. Was Jack's failure to maintain professionalism a result of his emotional distress, or was it simply a lapse in personal integrity? Could Emily, as a young flight attendant, have recognized the potential dangers of becoming too close to a pilot, and should she have removed herself from the situation before it escalated? And, perhaps most significantly, should Ryan Matthew have intervened sooner, confronting both Jack and Emily directly about their inappropriate behavior? In the aftermath, many argued that the issue was not simply about two people making a mistake. It was a reflection of a broader culture within the aviation industry that placed immense pressure on its employees, often with little regard for their emotional well-being. The fact that Jack, a seasoned pilot, had reached a point where he could not handle the stresses of his personal life without resorting to dangerous behavior in the cockpit spoke to the need for deeper systemic change. The emotional toll of the scandal and its aftermath on the individuals involved was profound. While the industry began to change, the personal lives of those directly impacted by the tragedy continued to unravel. For Emily Carter, the fallout was both professional and personal. She had lost her job, her career prospects, and her reputation. What had once seemed like a private matter had exploded into a public scandal that could not be erased. In the months following the incident, Emily struggled with feelings of guilt and regret. She had never intended for things to spiral so out of control. In interviews, she spoke candidly about her own emotional turmoil. "I didn't realize how much I was running away from my own problems. I thought I was just connecting with someone who understood me," Emily said in one public interview. "But now I see that I put not only myself but so many others in danger, and I'll never be able to forgive myself for that." Though Emily was dismissed from the airline, she did receive some support. The airline provided her with access to counseling services, and after a period of reflection, she began speaking out about the importance of mental health awareness in aviation. She became an advocate for improved resources for flight attendants and pilots, sharing her own story as a cautionary tale for others in the industry. Though it was unlikely she would return to aviation, Emily's journey towards redemption helped her find a sense of purpose again, though the scars of her past would always remain. Jack Swan's family, too, was left to deal with the long-term consequences of the tragedy. His wife, devastated by his death, struggled to comprehend how their family had been torn apart. Jack's depression and subsequent suicide were a direct result of the events that had unfolded in the cockpit, yet the family found themselves grappling with the guilt of wondering whether they had done enough to support him during his struggles. "Jack was a good man," his wife said in an emotional statement. "He was an amazing father and husband. But the world got too heavy for him, and no one really knew how much he was suffering." She spoke out about the need for better mental health support for pilots, urging the aviation industry to learn from the tragedy and to prioritize the well-being of their employees. Ryan Matthew, for his part, continued his career as a pilot but found the weight of the situation difficult to bear. He was lauded by some for his professional conduct, but the emotional toll of the incident never left him. He had made a decision that he believed was right, but the human cost of that decision, Jack's death, the destruction of Emily's career, and the public fallout, haunted him. In private conversations, Ryan admitted that he had struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering if there had been another way to handle the situation, one that didn't lead to such devastating consequences. However, in the years that followed, Ryan came to terms with his decision, though the scars of that flight would always linger. Skyfer Flight 717 remains a tragic reminder of the dangers of personal struggles left unchecked, of the complex interplay between professional conduct and personal emotions, and of the profound impact that human error can have on the lives of others. It highlighted the pressing need for better mental health support systems within high-pressure professions, particularly aviation, and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries in environments where trust and safety are paramount. The legacy of Flight 717 is a somber one, but it is not without its lessons. The changes that came in the wake of the tragedy, greater awareness of mental health, stricter oversight of professional conduct, and a renewed focus on the well-being of crew members, were important steps forward. Though the personal cost was high, the tragedy led to systemic changes that helped ensure a safer and more supportive environment for aviation professionals. Ultimately, the story of Captain Jack Swan, Emily Carter, and Ryan Matthews serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of personal responsibility, the necessity of professional integrity, and the undeniable fact that mental health must be prioritized in high-stakes environments. The lessons learned from Flight 717 may have come at a great cost, but they have left behind a legacy that, in time, may help save lives.